All right, welcome everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our policy panel today and to our last session for the 2022 Symposium on Children. I'm Jamie O'Leary, the Associate Director of Policy and External Affairs for the Crane Center. And for those of you who've logged into other sessions today, thank you for sticking with us. If you're just now joining, thank you also for joining. I know that Friday afternoon can be a tough time of day, and this panel is perhaps what's standing between you and your weekend, maybe a Halloween party, hopefully something fun for you. Today we have an esteemed lineup of folks to hear from. Here is what you can expect for the next hour. First, I will introduce each of them briefly. Then we're going to dive into a few rounds of questions, and you'll have a chance to submit many of your own questions. We're going to spend at least 15 minutes toward the end. For our audience, feel free starting now to say hi and introduce yourself in the chat box. As you formulate questions for our panelists, please post those in the question box. It's a bit easier for us to track them there than in the chat box. So for today's Symposium on Children, we've been talking about what it means to invest in children. We've heard research from Dr. Kira Bo-Jackson on the long-term impact of these investments. We've heard breakout sessions on topics including the Build Back Better plan and its failure to pass, how to think about preschool fade out and effectiveness, and food insecurity issues among children. We know that investing in children is expensive, but we also know that we already spend billions, in fact, trillions of our tax dollars on other things. Today, you're going to hear from folks who have found creative and courageous ways to finance programs for young children in their communities, even as we wait for Congress to pass more sustainable long-term funding solutions. Our panelists today are not only tremendous thought leaders, but they have rich experience for us to learn from. So thank you so much for joining us. With that, let's go ahead and meet each of them. First, we have Leslie Barnes. She is the director of the Preschool for All program in Multnomah County, Oregon, where she oversees the program's implementation from the ground up. No big deal, that's not hard. Scaling it to universal preschool by 2031. And she was also instrumental in the work of getting it on the ballot in 2020 and passed. She has worked on many aspects of the early learning system in Oregon with coordination, family child care networks, as the state of Oregon QRIS specialist, and as a small business owner, as a provider, ECE consultant, and a veteran of the United States Army. Welcome, Leslie.
Thanks for having me.
Next, we have Reginald Harris, or Reggie. He is a senior fellow at the Children's Funding Project, which is a nonprofit social impact organization that helps communities and states expand equitable opportunities for children and youth through strategic public financing. He's also a city council member for the city of Cincinnati here in Ohio. He is a former professional ballet dancer, educator, licensed therapist, and board chair for Equality Ohio. You all have some incredible life and professional experiences. Welcome, Reggie.
Thank you for having me.
Next up, we have Elliot Haskell. He is an expert on child and family policy issues. He's the author of the book, Crawling Behind America's Child Care Crisis and How to Fix It. He's a frequent commentator for both TV and news media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. Thanks for coming today, Elliot.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, we have Elsa Olguin. She is the CEO and president of the Denver Preschool Program, which makes preschool possible for all 4-year-olds in Denver through a dedicated sales tax that was passed by voters. She's originally from a small town in Mexico. Elsa came to the US as a teenager and was drawn to nonprofit work, including over 2 decades spent as a senior program officer for child and family development at the Rose Community Foundation. In addition to her current role at Denver Preschool Program, she serves on the board of Tools of the Mind and the Preschool Policy Leadership Committee. Welcome, Elsa. Okay, so I've got a kickoff question for each of you. As always, if thoughts come to mind, jump in. We're going to sort of just tag team and have a really robust discussion. So Leslie, you're first. Preschool for All provides free universal preschool for 3- and 4-year-olds in Multnomah County, Oregon, and it was established by voter approval through a ballot initiative. Specifically a tax on high income earners. So my question for you is, how on earth did you accomplish this? Or more seriously, can you tell us about the preliminary work leading up to 2020 that made that possible?
Thanks again for having me. Again, I'm Leslie Barnes. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the director of the Preschool and Early Learning Division here in Multnomah County. Just for a little context, Multnomah County is the most populous county in Oregon and the most diverse. But just to answer your question, I mean, we had a long process and build up, but we called what we were doing community-based participatory policymaking. We really landed and focused on racial equity and family choice in that process. So a huge part of the success of this is that we had a robust community engagement and planning effort. Took over 2 years. We had over 100 folks involved in that. And we really had a strong, charge from families and parents. Our PAC, who's a part of United Way, our Parent Accountability Council really led us in that as well. But we had many kinds of preschool providers from, the Head Start providers in the community, to national chains, to small preschool providers, leaders from higher ed, business, philanthropy, housing, healthcare. They really created the foundation for the work. But one of the key components we had was a political leader who really championed this effort and helped bring the folks together. And that was key to pulling together those community members and really gave us a chance to achieving a success in the ballot, which, by the way, almost had 70% of voters saying yes to that opportunity. But really, one of the things I want to point out is really valuing the expertise of those parents and practitioners in the space, and not just leaning as heavily as we typically do on research. I mean, so from that interaction, we learned that the things that most of us already know, families need a 10-hour a day. Folks use preschool for childcare. They need non-traditional hours. And so what does it look like to design a preschool system that values that and allows providers to tell us what their business model is, and we support that business model. So what does it look like if preschool starts later in the day, say at 5 p.m.? Can we still get like those 900 hours of instructional time, and what does that look like? And we also really knew that we needed to support small businesses that we were going to ask to partner in this whole piece as we built the infrastructure. And we know that many of those small businesses do not have that critical business infrastructure to help them contract with someone like the county. So we had intermediary organizations that we knew would be a part of the plan. We had a dedicated staff person before it became a reality in the county that made sure all of these interactions and opportunities and the plan was well built. And then we really looked closely at what worked and what were the challenges in other jurisdictions that already had preschool. Just so you know, preschool started for us just last month. So Kids on Carpet started last month. And so we really wanted to make sure we included family childcare, for example, because we know that that's our best opportunity for that, rich language and cultural offerings for families. And we also wanted to look at things like what impact could we have on infant toddler offerings in the community. So we really took a long time to have a map. And as we're implementing, we're using that map to really build success in that. So start early, bring all the folks to the table, and really value them at the table and listen to what they tell you.
Fantastic, thank you. Reggie, as a senior fellow at Children's Funding Project and a newly elected city councilor for Cincinnati, you sit at a very unique intersection in these two roles. Can you tell us about the Children's Funding Project and what you see as the biggest opportunities and challenges for cities like the one you represent when it comes to financing early care and education?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great question. Thank you. So again, Reggie Harris. So the Children's Funding Project, we lead cities and states, and we work closely with Multnomah County on their successful initiative and their ballot levy. But essentially, we lead this process called strategic public financing. And what that is that it's a process that assigns a cost to the goals and policy priorities a community sets for children and youth, identify ways to cover that cost. And the process is guided by 3 questions, right? So how much funding do we currently have? And we call this fiscal mapping. And the idea is to get a sense of what are all of the ways in which we fund services related to children and youth. And when we say children and youth, we mean infant, toddlers, children and youth, right? And then we do this thing called cost modeling. So how much does it truly cost to meet our policy goals and objectives? And so we are having conversations about wages for particularly early childhood education workers and the disparities in wages, right? So you see cities where fast food restaurants are paying folks $18 an hour and our childcare workers are getting paid $11, $12 an hour. So we ask ourselves, how much does it truly cost to advance X, Y, and Z goals? And then when we arrive at the delta, what's the plan to finance that? And so we think about weaving a number of public financing strategies to pay for that. So not only ballot levies, which might be a property tax increase or a sales tax increase, but also looking at emerging funding ideas, which we'll talk more about, using payment in lieu of taxes or using revolving loan funds or development impact fees. And the idea of creating the strategic public finance plan is to take services related to children and youth and move them from like a do good, goods and services investment to a public good akin to infrastructure. So we think about, every city and locality has a strategic plan for roads and for bridges and for water, and then we want them to have one for children and youth.
Thank you. That's exactly right. Okay, Elliot, in order to achieve local wins like the ones that we are talking about in Oregon and Colorado, it requires voter support and buy-in from the community. In your view, what are the three strongest messages you think, well, two or three, that we should be focusing on in order to achieve more widespread or mainstream support for investments in children?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think the first overarching thing I'd say is, that we have to tailor our messages for the audience, and then often there'll be multiple messages for various audiences. So, like something I think that was so impressive about the Multnomah campaign was the way that they were able to get such a wide coalition. And I know from interviewing folks involved in that, the message they were talking to the, healthcare folks was a little different than when they were talking to the, educators. And that I think is, for one thing, is very important. So you always tailor the message to the audience. But I want to be a little bit sort of provocative because I've become relatively convinced some of the messages we've been using over the past decade or two, I think we're starting to run up to the end of their usefulness. And I think in particular, like the return on investment argument, the economic case is accurate, is absolutely true. And I also think we're starting to only get marginal gains on that. We've convinced just about everyone who's going to be convinced by it. And it's not necessarily compelling to someone who isn't convinced by it, but is often our go-to. And so, and I think on some level, that's actually even true for the child development argument, where we're starting to, absolutely true. It doesn't resonate with everyone. And the people who it does resonate with, I think we've gotten that message out fairly well. So what I've been trying to push the field to think about is are there broader values-based messages we can start connecting into that really, because what we're trying fundamentally to do, and Reggie nodded towards this, is say, actually, early care and education is a public good. It is something there is a collective social responsibility for, and therefore it is deserving of large amounts of permanent public money. Right now, we mostly have a system where we think of childcare as an individualized market good, right? It's much more like it's like a gym or it's a restaurant, and so we're going to make that argument. I think we actually need to call to values like freedom and self-determination. Like, I think it's very compelling when you look at the number of families who are not having kids that they want to have, or having kids spaced out differently than they want to have them for no other reason than the availability of affordable and high quality childcare, right? And that we have, people who are either not able to create this work care situation, not able to provide for their families because they're not able to get a job because of childcare. Like, these are very core American values. And I think we can start to talk about that, the impact that this has, on our ability and our communities, when people are leaving our communities, especially from the cities, because there's not childcare, when, we're losing out on opportunities for families to engage in entrepreneurship, business ownership, because again, they're being sucking out $10,000+ a year into childcare. And I think really, it's a really fundamental question of, do you get to choose to have the family that you want to have based on your preferences, on your values, or is it based on the availability of childcare? So, I think those messages could open up a new constituency and really broaden our support. Because the one other thing I'll say is there's this interesting disconnect where when you poll, the public on things like early childhood education, it's sky high, right? 80, 90, 95%, cross parties, cross ideologies. But then if you look at the salience of that, and by that just means like, how much does it influence someone's vote? How much are they talking to an elected official about it? How much are they saying, if you don't vote for this, I am not going to vote for you? It's pretty low. And so something's missing there in the way that we're talking to voters. And I think when we think about our messages, we have to be thinking not just about getting popular support in a general sense, but does it actually mobilize action? Does it mobilize actual voter accountability to electeds?
Provocative is good. Keep it coming. This is all good stuff.
I almost wanted to do like an amen. That was a little some gospel there.
Right. Right.
Yes. Use your
totally
emojis. We can keep chatting about that. Let me ask Elsa her intro question, then we can come right back to that, because I sense that there's more to be said on that.
Oh, yes.
Yes. So Elsa, the Denver preschool program, we know has been around for quite some time. It was approved by voters in 2006, reauthorized in 2014, and is funded by a sales tax. From your perspective as the CEO, and also I know you were instrumental in incubating the idea way back when, what are the key pillars of success for creating such a long-standing program? If you had advice for community advocates on today's call wanting to fund their own such program, what are those top pieces of advice?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. What a great opportunity to be with this amazing panel. So thank you. It is always fun. It is always fun to talk about the Denver preschool program, because you're right, we're almost 16 years old. We have provided $150 million in tuition support. Along with that, almost $26 million in quality improvement funding, and have served 65,000 children in Denver. So we're feeling very lucky that we have had the opportunity to provide this impact in Denver. But here, because we just finished advising the state in Colorado, for the first time, we have a universal preschool tax that was approved a couple of years ago. We're sales tax, the city of Denver. The state is a nicotine tax. It's both liquid and nicotine. And it's just getting off the ground next year. So we've been advising the state as well on the opportunities to do it. Here are some pillars of what I think it is successful. What we knew from the beginning is that we were entering a very unstable market, in that unlike some of the other systems where you pass a tax and you go and purchase what you need to buy, in the early childhood system, you have to go and fix the system, and then you can put the children through the system. And by that, I mean, when we're talking about quality preschool, in Denver in 2006, there were 45 high quality providers. So the idea of universal preschool in Denver was not even going to be possible. We were not going to work as hard on the supply as we were going to do on the demand. Hence, from the very beginning, we started putting very high investment in quality improvements, because this is not a ready market. So you have to be ready from the get-go to say, we need to invest in developing the quality, developing the workforce, developing the resources as we are getting ready to go and find the family. So our formula, for example, is about 70% of our funding goes for tuition support. About 7% is the administrative expenses to run the program, and the remaining of the money includes substantial funding for quality improvements. It also have substantial funding for evaluation, and we have to plan that from the very beginning. We have to go to the voters every 10 years in Denver, so we have to have data to show that we were successful and that we are a proven model and to be able to do it. So we actually have 3 evaluations going on. One is a long-term evaluation, and that we have been following all our students from the very beginning. Our first cohort is now in college. So we have been able to show what is the impact over the years of the evaluation, not just the short-term results. We have a kindergarten readiness assessment so that we know short-term what happened. And then we have a process evaluation because we're in this continuous improvement approach. And we also invest heavily in outreach and marketing, because if you're going to be a universal program, we are doing everything from promotoras, the community workers, knocking door to door, to advertising on NPR. So we have to have this high reach on how do you do these resources. And the Universal Preschool Program in Colorado is modeled after us, so they have the same elements. So it's marketing and outreach, evaluation, tuition, and quality improvement. So the planning has to be from the beginning of how do you enter into this imperfect market that is still developing. So that will be my advice. Think in advance how those resources need to be allocated.
Thank you, Elsa. That's great. You are speaking my language. If you build it, they will come is not true, as we know. So thank you for highlighting that. I'm going to come back to, we were sort of starting to talk about messaging and getting more voters to, put their money where their mouth is, more policy leaders. Do the other three of you have thoughts about that messaging? What aren't we focusing enough on? Or sort of as Elliot touched on, what are some messages we maybe need to set aside?
I have lots of thoughts about it, most all in agreement. And I just want to add, one of the things that attracted me to the Children's Funding Project is because I think, and Elliot, to its point, we have a great repertoire of emotional, moral-based, good for the good cause, like messaging to talk about, why this is so important, but we just have neglected the finance piece of it. And so we have this very backwards model where random sums of money are given, and then we try to retrofit outcomes to the random sums. And it's like, okay, like $200 million, it depends on what you want to do with $200 million, right? So $200 million allocated to out of school time programming doesn't mean anything if we actually haven't identified goals. And so this idea of saying with quality and with care and with thinking about workers and with thinking about communities, the economic impact to a community to successfully fund out of school time costs this much. And so this is what we need. And then I think it shifts the return on investment conversation, because we're saying, like, when we pay workers, they participate in the economy. And, and then with COVID, we recognize, right, all of a sudden there's this whole group of people that are like, wait, what? Childcare, what? Like, my little child's a monster. Like, how does my teacher do it all the time? And so we recognize that in the larger group, there are people, and particularly Black women, who've known that childcare is a workforce development issue, bar none. But now I think we just have the opportunity to talk about the true raw economics of infant, toddler, and youth services.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And I've heard people say, because our tax base is high income earners, the highest income earners in our area. And I've had people say, how do I get this message? So return on investment hasn't resonated with them, but folks that are in business know they need folks that come to work. They can't build back or bounce back. If we're talking about just the greed of that, let's just get away from the fluffy talk and be like, if you want to be in business, right, you have to have what you said, invest this amount of money for folks to be able to work for you. And if you can't do that, then you no longer can gain those riches that are allowing you to pay into this tax. Like, those are the kinds of messages that are important. And there's another set of messaging that I want to push forward about respecting early learners in this field as a real career path. Like, we have a bad reputation of not paying people well, that there is no real career path. What we do is invite people to be teachers, and all of a sudden when the director quits, they're director. Like, what is the career path, and what is the messaging about this as a real journey for you along a career, and not just a stop onto your real job? I mean, so there's messaging that needs to be had about what is ECE as a career path to younger folks that are like in high school, to people that are in college, because folks here in Oregon, our counselors in college have to push their students away from ECE because it doesn't pay well. So there's some new messaging about what is this really that we're saying? You know, are we giving new messaging about a career path and to the point of business? Like, if it's about you opening your doors and maintaining business, restaurants, et cetera, you have to invest in this. So just from the sense of profitability, that's a new message I think that we need to push readily.
Yeah, well said. And I'll agree with great comments, but I want to comment on something that I am working on this week because I thought, oh, this is fascinating. I always have so much fun. I'm working with a reporter that is following up on a story about the decline of poverty for young children. And she said, they told me I needed to talk to you because somehow this is connected to early childhood. And I can't figure out what the story is. I thought, oh, I know the story. I know the story. The story is about 2-generational impact and what happens when you have the ability to have 2 people in the household being able to work full time rather than one. And it was fascinating because she was initially thinking, oh, I thought this was about parents just going to higher education and everybody got better jobs. I said, well, yeah, that's one way to look at your income coming to the family. But the immediate impact that happens when we are helping the families with the cost of care, which we know is extremely high for early education. And if we have young children or grandchildren, in my case, we know how our lives shifted from what we were paying for tuitions for our young children, for our 3 and 4-year-olds and our babies, to when they started school. And it's like, oh, now I can buy a house. Now I can buy a car. Now I can do all these things. So we have this immediate economic impact. But the second economic impact is you have 2 wage earners, which can move people from poverty long-term to the next level. And I think it's all connected, Elliot, what you were saying. We are not telling the impact story about not just what's happening to the child, but what's happening to the family and their ability to have the income, to have the assets, to buy a home, to be able to prosper. And even more important, what's happening to that community? And what happens when you have a reliable worker that can come because they have access to care? And what's happening when you have a thriving economy because you made this investment? So I think we sometimes only tell a piece of the story, but it's the whole story. Or we end up with an amazing reporter who's asking the right question, but it was like, oh, I didn't think about it in that big picture, but that is the big picture. So when we see early childhood poverty reduction in the last 2 decades, it's like, what happened in the last 2 decades? It's like, hello, we mean investing in the last 2 decades. That's what happened with people in the workforce.
Can I add one more thing too, Jamie?
Oh, of course.
So I think all of those, I appreciate all of those comments and I agree with them. And I would add one thing, which I think we desperately need to adopt a rights-based language in early childhood. So the difference between a service and frankly, childcare, as we know, has been maligned as welfare very intentionally, very racist ways for a very long time. One way we reclaim that is by talking about it as a right. Public education in this country is a right. It exists in all 50 state constitutions. Everyone knows it. It has all sorts of problems and all sorts of inequities, but like it is free and it is accessible to everyone. But we don't often talk about the fact that early care and education should be a right and really push people on like, why is it that we treat the first 5 years of life so radically differently than we treat the next 12 years of life? Those some of the conversations I can like that I find most sort of fruitful to change people's mind. Like that actually is kind of odd. Like, why is it that we sort of, hand people a thin blanket and say, good luck, we'll see you in 5 years for your free, care and education, at least for some number of hours of the day and the year. So we have to start talking about it as a right. And I think that's really going to help us. And, I do think I'm seeing some comments in the chat, like the language we use. Yeah, like what we call this a field, or, it's still an active conversation, early childhood education, some people overseas, it's interesting. Most of the other countries call it things like early childhood care and education, or early childhood education and care, or the early years. They usually have some sort of inclusive term that mentions that it's care and education. And I sometimes argue that elementary school is middle childhood care and education, but I do think that if we think about the language we use, we cannot accept the premise that this is welfare. We can't accept the premise that this is something that only some set of lower income parents need. We cannot accept the premise that this is an individual issue that's just on the parents to figure out. If it is a social good, if it is a public good, it should be a right. It should be provided universally. And I argue it should be free. I think that's probably a ways away, but when we start putting this out there as the vision. And the last thing I'll say about that is, I think one of the big challenges we're encountering at the state and local level is we're finally starting to see these cost models that Reggie's mentioning. We're finally starting to see people put numbers to it. And the numbers are really high. We should name that. When you look at states, whether it's California, whether it's Virginia, whether it's any of these states, it's $1 billion. It's $10 billion a year, right? In California, they're saying they're going to need, and it makes policymakers, I think, go that's wild. We're not doing that. And so then we we negotiate with ourselves way down. But if you come up from the standpoint of, no, this is a right, it is putting immense value economically in terms of lifting people into the middle class, in terms of allowing communities to flourish, in terms of the early childhood sector itself producing economic value. You can make the case it's an investment. Investments pay off. But we have to, meet the price tag with the messaging that justifies it. The messaging that justifies is never going to be this is a public assistance program, and we just need to increase subsidy so that some modest number more people can get it. It has to be a right, because there's a reason public education is the single largest or second largest line item in every single state budget, and it's because it is a right.
Absolutely. A cultural mind shift is where we're at, right? And I think that this light was shown in it when COVID came. The blessing and the curse of COVID was that. And I think we're already forgetting that just happened, that we're still bouncing back from that. And so we have to keep pushing home what you're talking about here is this: we have to say that is a right, a public good, just like public school is. And I think we're not there yet. And if we let this moment pass, we will soon forget how critical childcare was when people were trying to keep their businesses open during COVID.
And just to add on really quickly, and in the example of education, when we establish this as a right, when we think about the funding model, right, there are federal dollars, there's state, income tax dollars, and then there are, county dollars, there's city dollars, right? There is a spectrum of funding that is woven together to pay for this. And so just again, going back to that strategic public financing, and I know there's a question in the chat about these gaps. Gaps are always, they're accounted for, right? No city solely relies on federal dollars to maintain roads. It's a combination of a federal and a state and a local expenditure, and then a tax and a levy, and so that shift is important, and we have a model for how to fund public goods.
Yes, thank you, Reggie. You're teeing me up perfectly for the next question I had. Two quick things I want to say first. The chat is incredible. We're about 10 minutes out from when I'll open up the question box, so definitely put your questions there. I'll turn to that in just a few minutes. Earlier today, we were talking about how New Mexico has put on the ballot a program that would make it a constitutional right to early childhood education. So I love that that came up today. I'm curious if more states will end up doing that. And I also want to call out and reiterate, thank you. I think Jessica Junk, she's a teacher at our partner school at the A. Sophie Rogers School, reminded us not to call it daycare, but to call it some version of early care and education, high quality early care and education, really to emphasize the quality piece. So you started teeing this up, Reggie. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction here and ask, as we all know, states have very different levels of leadership and support when it comes to funding this. How important is it to achieve federal or state funding versus going it alone at the county or local level? or county or city level? And do you have any advice for folks on today's call for what we can do to get Congress to act? So either piece of that.
Yeah, so, I'm a city council member, so I have a bias towards local government. And I think in this moment, we almost see the reverse happening, where we see cities and like villages and towns doing really innovative things around financing and funding, education, arts, transportation, housing, and that the state and the federal government are sort of like catching up, right? Like it's kind of like, oh, whoa, like how do we get in on this? And so I do think, and so for me, I'm deeply a pragmatist. And so I believe that one strategy really is, and let me give one more comment before I go into it. And I think our national political narratives don't necessarily play out in such a polarized extent in local politics, right? So I am a progressive Democrat on a majority Democratic council. Cincinnati is run by the business community, which is largely Republican. So I work closely every day with Republicans, and we are like aligned 9.5 times out of 10 on things that impact our children and our families and our streets, right? So like there is this way of working locally to identify like how you can impact infant, childhood, youth services in your city, and then taking that model to the state, to the county, to the feds, being like, listen, this is what we're doing here, get on board, and really pushing back in how money is coming down. Like, well, we don't need dollars for this, or we need these X amount of dollars. So I do want to push tapping into these local efforts, because just some really incredible creative things are happening. And I think it's a way to sort of reverse how we think about financing.
I want to jump in here too. And I think when you talk about all these different funding streams, we have to also get out of siloing. When we came on board, there's heads start saying, oh, slots are being taken from us, this is being taken, and it's all about family choice in our jurisdiction. So how do we share what's going well in Head Start, for example? They do great family engagement, have a history of that, but our family child care providers don't have the infrastructure for that. So how can we share, right? I think in the meantime, while Build Back Better is being imagined or comes back to us, we need to get tighter in how we align our systems locally with state, with all the things that go well, and get out of this idea that if this happens, I'm losing. It's about families finding no wrong door and getting all their needs met. And I think we have not quite done that yet. And I don't know how well that's going other places, but we are at the table just starting. Like I said, our seat just came open a month ago. And so we are like bringing those partners, the school, everyone to the table, like, what do we do to really support families in this and get out of our own way?
I just add, because we're doing the city-state funding continuum in Colorado, as excited as I am about those two and ready to go and ready to support it, and I totally agree that there is a lot of value on the local perspective. There is absolutely no way that we can do early education without the federal government making substantial investments. Our local communities do not have the ability to raise the funds that we need to do. And I just met last week with Senator Hickenlooper, and I was showing him the numbers and saying there is no way that we don't have enough taxes to be able to finance what is needed at the local level. And I think at least for this reality right now, we need this continuum of funding to be able to make it work. Maybe one day, we will have federal funding that is sufficient, but yeah, it's challenging to say, how do we do it? And we're only talking about preschool in Colorado. To do the continuum of funding, it is so much more, which is what Leslie said. We have to meet families to where they are, and the need is not just for preschool, it's the whole spectrum of infant until they are ready to start school.
Yeah, I won't add up much because I think, as local leaders, you all know much more of this. And I would agree, like the federal funding at some point is going to have to come in. It's also an equity question. Not everyone has amazing, has someone who's going to be early childhood, champion. Not every county has the tax base to do it, and so it shouldn't be that your zip code determines, how effective of an early care system you have access to, which is some of the inequities in our public school funding models as well. In terms of that second question of what can we be doing, look, I mean, we should be sober and honest that like we're likely heading into divided government and we are likely heading into some gridlock for a while. That said, power building is an immensely important activity, laying the groundwork. And so we can look to other fields for this. It took decades for healthcare advocates to be able to succeed with things like Medicaid expansion, the Affordable Care Act, right? Like it's taken decades for climate advocates to be able to get, the what was passed in Inflation Reduction Act. So it can take a really long time. But what you can do in those sort of like off years when the government is just not in your favor is you can be organizing, you can be building that power. Right? There's some comments in the chat about unions, and I think that's a really interesting thing for the child care field to be thinking about. And that work can still happen to build that constituency so that when there's an old theory of political change called the streams and windows theory. I don't know if it's perfect, but I think it's okay, which basically says like from time to time the stars align, a window opens, and if you are ready for it, you can push policy change through. And if you're not, it's probably going to close before you can. And I think one of our charges in what can be a very demoralizing time, especially with what happened with Build Back Better, is to keep it power building, to keep that groundwork being laid so that we are ready for the next federal opportunity when it opens in whatever form it opens, while we're continuing to do this great work, as everyone's talking about, the local level, to prove what can be done and to also just continue to serve the children and families that are here now and have needs now.
Thank you. Yes, please, to all of that. All right, I'm going to do one more question, slightly on a different track before turning it over to the chat, and then I'll read some aloud and maybe toss in a few more. Tell us about a key personal experience that brought you to the work that you're doing now.
I'll start. I shared earlier in my bio that I was a veteran, and I was a mom and a soldier when I was early in my career as in the Army. And when it was time for me to find childcare for my own child while I was serving my country, I couldn't find it. The hours didn't work. I had to be, on base at 6 a.m. Nothing was open there. So I had to rely on family childcare and really give my baby over to someone I felt reminded me of my auntie, like back home in the States. I was in Germany at the time. That's all I really had. So that was one key experience. And when I went further on in my career and I left the military and got my degree in human development, knew how important, right, the things that you do with children and how you talk to them and all those things, I really interacted with that. That was another key moment. The last one was when I did start my career, I worked with the Child Care Resource and Referral, and I noticed that providers were really struggling to navigate systems in a way that I struggled to navigate the system that I was in the Army. And when I heard things about quality coming up and licensing struggles and all those kinds of things, I gathered enough information to know the ways that we need to approach the work now. There's a power dynamic for our Black and brown women who are typically the ones doing this work and where they don't know how to interact with these systems. And so how do we honor a family choice like I did when I was in the Army to choose someone that felt like home, but also empower them to have those children be ready, have families be ready as they interact with K-12. And so these moments in time where I got to support providers and really hear how they were struggling to get vouchers or really stand up for themselves and have a handbook and say, I can't subsidize you, lady, because you have to go out to the field. That happened to me. I had to go out to the field one time and pay for late care, overnight care, and my paycheck couldn't support that. And that provider, I wanted her to give me a discount for that. It was not her role for me to pull from her family's resources to do that, but I had nowhere else to go. And so these are the key moments in time. And my last job before I got this was in quality rating and improvement for the state of Oregon. And I realized all the inequity in that system, and it really did not tell us about quality, right? It really just allowed people who wrote well to submit a document that look like a little bit like quality, and really excluded folks that spoke other languages and had other cultural, right, lenses to what quality was. And so all of this is why I'm here today for this moment in time, because there's so many things that are right, but so many things that we need to knit together that are not quite right to make this something real and tangible and equitable for our children and families. And that's where we're at now. Like, what does it look like for me to find curriculum that's not in my language? So we have a coaching system that really helps come alongside and say, you know, you really are doing that right thing. And we're going to call it this, and this is what they mean when they say that. People navigating, right, folks across systems. So those are what bring me to the work and why I'm excited about it. I know there's a lot wrong, but there's a lot of things that we can do right with the right connections.
Yeah, so my journey to this work, it's not inspiring like Leslie's at all. In fact, I'm gonna be very honest, it's like, I don't know, it's interesting. My husband and I have been together 17 years. You know, we are not interested in having kids. I tell parents all the time, you never sell having kids. You always talk about how difficult kids are, and then at the end you say, but I love them. And we're like, no, we're not gonna have them, right? But when I was running for office, you do a lot of like reflection on like how you got to where you are. And my last job before being elected, I worked for an affordable housing developer. So I worked with a developer, and I was so shocked about how much early childhood education, I know we don't like the phrase daycare, childcare, but I'm using the language that was used in this word. Daycare, childcare came up in managing our buildings, and property managers being like, you know, when there are a lot of kids in the buildings most of the day, the buildings are like hard to keep up. Like it is an expense. It's like, it was literally, you could see our expenses with buildings that in communities where most of the children time was occupied, versus when they're in neighborhoods where children were in the house or in the building most of the time. The expenses were like, it was a huge difference, right? And so I guess I came to it from just like this sort of financial aspect of being like, oh, there's just a real cost in this kind of backwards way. But then when I started to think about my own experience and think about the own good fortune I've had in my life, I was a Head Start kid. And I loved Head Start, and I went to like a great Head Start program that has been in my community forever. And then I lived in the house with my grandmother. We lived in a multi-generational house. So my mom worked, my grandmother didn't work, and my grandmother was my daycare, my childcare provider. So my mom, she didn't make a lot of money, didn't have the expense of having to pay for someone because it was multi-generational living. And that gave me so many opportunities. And so and this is really kind of like in the last 2 years, the light bulb moment of being like, oh, whoa, like this is huge. Like this is huge. Like I am here where I am today because my mom did not have to pay for my education. What, you know, like it sounds obvious now, but I think for a lot of people are like me that don't make those connections in that intense way. And then in thinking about community and economic development and recognizing like, you know, communities are healthy when there are an ebb of flow of people in and out of the community. And so that's really how I came to this work, is sort of that sort of backwards approach of seeing the impact of the lack of access, reflecting on my life, seeing that I had access, and then being like, oh, okay, this is really important.
I want to make sure we have time to get to questions, so I'll just be real quick because there are a couple of threads in my story, but one that really helped sort of cement it when I was already heading that direction was having a kid. Kids are awesome, Reggie. They were, you know, I had my first kid. My wife and I were, you know, we had every privilege under the sun, both demographically and like we are in, you know, in our 30s. We both were employed. You know, we both had graduate degrees, and like we were married for a while, and to it was so difficult to find and it was so expensive. We had it and we were so unsure about the quality, and all of our friends having kids around the same time in the same boat were having those experiences. And I was like, if it is this hard for us with all of the privileges that we have, like what must this be like for everyone who doesn't? And that was sort of, I remember a moment sitting around the like kitchen table being like, how is this possibly the way that we've decided to treat, you know, tens of millions of American families? And so that definitely cemented the push into early childhood.
Yeah, I will also be brief so we can go to the questions, but it's very similar. Yeah, I actually have a degree in finance. So when people ask me, how did you end up in early childhood? It really was my work in philanthropy, and that I spent a great deal of time at the beginning of my career funding children, youth, and families, and realizing as I was looking at where do we get the biggest return on our investments as we were funding, it was early childhood. So little by little, I just focused more and more on the work on early childhood. But I also attended preschool in Mexico because I come from a family of teachers, and like Reggie, I said, I got a great start because I was able to attend preschool.
Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing that. I have goosebumps. I think that's my favorite question. All right, turning to the chat, we've got two questions here about cost modeling and sort of the cost of care. One of them asks that we talk about Title 20, discrepancy between what programs pay centers and what market standard rates are. How does this impact centers? We have another question similar. Can you talk about how we can rethink or restructure cost modeling to actually accurately reflect the true cost of care? So I'll stop there, just cost of quality in general. Your thoughts on that?
I can answer that really quickly and shortly. So children'sfundingproject.org. Go to our website. There are a lot of tools we can use, but essentially it is a process that we can lead you through that helps arrive and sort of define true cost. So like, you know, parity wages and really infrastructure costs and inflation and all of these pieces that aren't truly used. And so it's a very straightforward formula that can be used. So children'sfundingproject.org, lots of information. Then you can reach out and we can help think about, because it's really a place-based and time-specific process, right? It's not blanket, but you have to really focus in on where you are in the time that you're doing it.
Thank you. We have two questions about universal childcare. One is about how can we achieve this for children under the age of 3. The other is just a broad question. What are some of the barriers? Is it purely about cost or are there other problems?
Yeah, it's a great questions. I can happy to start and then be curious. Because, you know, I think with incredible respect to the UPK programs represented here, like the artificial split between pre-K and childcare or daycare, all the things we call them, has been damaging. And is even if you looked at Build Back Better, right? Build Back Better said universal pre-K, but we're going to expand the subsidy system down here. So part of it is reframing to a comprehensive birth to 5 system. Again, call it the early years system, call it the early care and education system, whatever you want to call it. And then it has to be designed that way. It has to be funded that way. Again, it's not everyone doesn't share my opinion, but if we march the school system back, we were never going to get where we need to go. We have to talk, and that is inappropriate developmentally, in my opinion, as well, to do that. I think we have to go forward, build up. So part of it is making that argument. Funding is absolutely it is a large barrier. Also, when you get down to the infants and the toddlers, we should name it. You run into the cultural barriers very quickly as well, with questions of, well, there are constituencies that do not want, women working at that, if they want them home with the children at that point. So you do run into some more questions there. And you run into something we don't talk about enough in our field, which is you run into paid family leave. And so that needs to be, like, I will also make the argument that the early care childhood education field and the paid family leave advocates need to be working a lot more closely together. They become very separate issues. It's really, again, it's part of an arc. And if you look at countries, around the world that's how it works, right? And you first year you're at your paid family leave, and then you transition into high quality, affordable childcare that you have a legal right to a spot for, and then you move at some point into the school system. And so again, I think it's if we're going to achieve it, is part of it is how we talk about it and how we propose it, and then is how we pay for it. And so that goes to the whole conversation we've been having, and thinking about forcing functions like rights, like constitutional amendments, things like that, thinking about entitlements that are putting into law, because at some point legislators are not likely to commit themselves to outlays of billions of dollars without a pretty hard push. And so I think if we're going to get there, it's naming the cost. And something I want to really emphasize that DPP has done, that Multnoma's done, the many other places, is if you think about the time frame they're giving themselves, and we want at UPK, we're going to be active by 2030, like 31, like that's important. We can't say we want universal childcare tomorrow, because frankly, we couldn't do it. If you dropped $400 billion into the field right now, we wouldn't be able to do it tomorrow. And so we have to say, this is what's going to cost. And if we want to get there in 10 years, here's how we're going to pay for it. We're going to phase in tax Y, tax Z, tax, X. And, we're going to be building supply and building workforce and doing all of these other things. So part of it too is sometimes I think we get caught in the short-termism of sort of call it the political cycle, the news cycle. These are long game plays, but it starts by having that vision that everyone gets behind, and then I think backwards planning from there and how you're going to fund it and how you're going to build the political will to get passed.
Excellent. I have a question. This might be our last. We might have time for another quick one. Can you tell us an innovative, courageous, or an exciting idea that you think we all should know about, and bonus points if it could work in a red state like Ohio? Have I stumped you, or we haven't unmuted?
Yeah, I think we're stumped with the red state. We have a lot of innovation in a red state like Ohio. I think the one that I will say is very, very important is the ability to keep teachers in early care and education in the workforce. So some of the innovation that we're doing in Colorado is making the investments as they are being invested in other workforce. And that means that we are looking at signing bonuses, retention bonuses, promotion bonuses, with a big look at parity with K-12 teachers, and looking at the cost and the salaries that are going to be there. Leslie, I think, mentioned it earlier today about workforce issues and where it's going to be. I don't think we're going to solve the problem of care and education, early care and education, until we figure out that we have a workforce opportunity to make some significant investments as we are making investments in other industries. So for me, that could be one of the innovation pieces that works for everybody. If we have the workers, then we can have the industry thrive.
I'll highlight a couple of things. First, with our Pathways initiative. So our Pathways program is to get folks ready, people that feel like they're not able to be a pilot site right now. So maybe you need some coaching about whatever practice you need help with. If it's around business, if it's around curriculum, whatever that looks like before you become. So we're trying to build a pipeline of folks that want to become in partnership with us as a pilot site. So that's one of the things, and they're incentivized, right, for their time. So we're also, there's some financial incentives for that participation in the pathways. And that's for people that aren't even necessarily licensed yet. How do we get them ready for that? Maybe they are licensed. So that's one thing I want to highlight. The other thing I want to highlight is our infant toddler support dollars. And so if you are a preschool for all site and you have an infant toddler program, we have a pay equity law, which means that if people are doing similar work, they need to receive similar pay. And so we are incentivizing programs that have infant toddlers teachers so they can make that same wage. So they are not feeling like, I need to jump ship and go over here and become a preschool teacher. And I really want to be an infant toddler teacher. So we are supporting that because we don't want to drain an already critical resource of our infant toddler slots, because we notice that we've heard that that's happened in other municipalities. And we talk to our pilot sites. For example, we're right now looking at people that want slots for next year. If you are increasing your slots for next year, are you getting rid of those infant toddler slots? And let's talk about why. And so we are really making sure that we're innovative in that way and make sure we're having these conversations with our sites to talk about what we aren't doing well and really being true partners in that.
Can I take 60 seconds to talk about Virginia before Laura? Virginia is not as red as Ohio, but it is a Republican governor and a Republican House of Delegates, and it actually just passed some pretty impressive reforms in the early childhood system, doing two things. One is it did go to cost of quality, so it follows New Mexico as a second state to do that. So programs are going to start getting between $1,000 and $10,000 more per kid, per year, depending on the age and where they are. And they're setting teacher salaries at 75% of that cost of quality. It's not all the way there. It's paid for with a lot of temporary ARPA money, but that is an example. And at the same time, they're doing an affordability play by capping parent fees for every parent who qualifies for subsidy, which is up to 85% of state median income now, which is up around like $70,000, $80,000 a year. And even at those higher levels, parents aren't going to be paying more than about $2,200 a year. And so Virginia, it's been kind of quiet. Can't exactly explain why that is. I'll drop a article about it into the chat though. But if you want a sort of a red to purple state, hope, I would say look to Virginia.
I'll take it. Reggie, any last words? And then I will turn it over to Laura.
Yeah, I would just say, this is where I really dig in on local cities. So Ohio is a red state, but there are blue cities, and there are even purple counties and villages and districts that are really doing interesting things. And so I think that trying to be a little bit more micro in terms of innovation is going to really probably yield more success than working at the state level, where we know where we are at a Republican supermajority and the values shared today are not in the top 1,000 list of policy priorities.
Well, thank you all so much. I don't know about you all, but this has been a life-giving conversation. I so appreciate all of our panelists, the expertise that you shared, the honesty and just provocativeness of some of the comments. Also to our audience, you all were phenomenal participants. Thank you so much. This is fantastic. I'm going to turn it over now for closing remarks to Dr. Laura Justice.
Great. Thank you so much. That was phenomenal. I'm Laura Justice, Executive Director of the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy here at Ohio State, and I'll just chat for just a couple moments to close us out. I hope you'll stay with me and I'm not just talking to a blank screen. Our 9th annual Symposium on Children provided a remarkable day of learning and thinking. And before I continue, I have to commend our amazing team here. Kathy Kupsky, Caitlin Lennon, Jamie O'Leary, and so many others who assisted and made this really seamless. To address our topic this year focused on investing in children, we brought together thought leaders, policymakers, and advocates to consider what investments are needed and why it's important. And I took notes all day, but I'm just going to boil my integrative thoughts down to 3 points. One of them goes back to Jamie's comments earlier today. I know that was not virtual, but she really emphasized that we need to move away from a scarcity mentality concerning the need to invest in children. The money is out there. As Lauren Jones, economist, discussed, everything in the world of social policy is about moving cash around. The money's out there, and based on Dr. Jackson's research, every dollar we put into early childhood, it's returned later, not in test scores, but improved employment, then taxes, and lowered reliance on welfare and social supports. And I'm going to turn back to this in a minute based on Elliot's comments about our messaging. Well, I'll mention now that he shared that really the return on investment should not be our go-to argument regarding why we need to increase investment in young children and their teachers. I'll come back to that in a minute. Next, I was really I sat up in my chair when Dr. Jackson was talking about how we always lean into test scores as our measure of early learning programs success. These are often used to question the importance of investing in early childhood, but test scores are not what is moving when we invest in early childhood programs for lots of different reasons. The long-term benefits are not the outcomes we're often looking at. So we really need to leverage these findings in our fight to right-size the city, state, and nation system of early care and education, including increasing teacher compensation. And I'm going to end on the note that I hope you were all at this last panel. There are really exciting innovations occurring across this country to promote equitable local and state wins in expanding early learning opportunities, as we learned from our colleagues in Oregon and Denver, and then references to Virginia. For instance, I was really excited by my cat is visiting, very exciting about the initiatives around wage parity for infant, toddler, and preschool teachers in Oregon. This requires leadership, perseverance, and then leading into a broader message concerning the value of early care and education programs that are not just, you'll get the dollar back. And as Elliot Haskell emphasized, early education is a right. Access to quality schooling should not begin when children are 5 or 6. In fact, this is an artificial barrier that differentiates infant, toddler, preschool care in the P-12 system. So we need to shift away from return on investment to argue that early education is a public good. It's as important as our roads, and it needs to be funded that way. Early learning investments create choice and freedom in building strong families and strong communities. If families cannot find quality care and education for their children, they're going to leave a community or they're not going to grow their family. So we need to, and I'm going to take this on for myself, we need to shift the conversation from dollar back for every dollar you put in and talk about quality care for young children as being their right and a public good. And I'm going to end on the note of, if we're to do that, we need to be very mindful of the language we are using. We are not investing in daycare. We are not investing in childcare. The amazing professionals who are in these classrooms and home-based care are educators. They are knowledgeable, they are committed, and the language we use comes to bear on the value that we place towards our earliest educators. So thank you for being with us. We are grateful of your attention to this topic, and we will see you next year and hopefully in between. Thank you and have a terrific weekend.